I would like to welcome everybody. I'm Lisa Siegel, and I'm going to facilitate the session today, in which we have Jubilee Smith and Dr. Sarah James presenting. And so first I want to say I'm here in Gumbaynggirr country, down near Coffs Harbour. I want to acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging. And we can all take a minute and ground ourselves down into whatever country we're on, acknowledge your own country in your own way, and take a deep breath. And here we are, very excited at our first presentation of PRAXIS. PRAXIS is such a beautiful event. I've loved it the last 2 years, and I'm excited for this new format, even though I do miss seeing everybody in person. What we are going to do is we have 2 presenters in this session. The first presenter will be Jubilee Smith, and then she will present for 15 minutes, have a 5-minute question and answer period. And then what we do is we all pop out of this Zoom room and into the next Zoom room for Sarah's presentation. So I'll remind you at the end. But we also have Leslie joining us. Hi, Leslie. Leslie's going to be the timekeeper, Jubilee and Sarah. So Leslie will give you a 12-minute warning and then let you know when 15 minutes is up. So without further ado, Jubilee, if you still can't see, I do want to remind you that in the conference app, there is a Q&A under questions for digital technology, under this stream, digital technology and early childhood education, which is Jubilee, there is a Q&A button, and it says, when you click on it, it says, do not be afraid to ask the dumb question. Everyone else will be relieved that you had the guts to ask. I don't know who wrote that, but that's there, and it's true. So you can, while Jubilee is speaking, you can type a question into that if you like, and I will make sure it gets answered if you don't want to say your question out loud, or you can say your question out loud at the end in the 5-minute question and answer period. So I'll be watching it. If everybody could mute themselves, and also if we could all turn off our cameras. Actually, Jubilee, you can't see us anyways, right?
I can't see you.
So it doesn't matter if your camera's off, but it would be great if obviously your microphone is off. Jubilee, you have people here. You have Amanda's here, Gurmeet, Tamara, Tilly, Maya, Dr. Watts, Allison, Marianne, Dennis. We're all here. Since you can't see who it is, you have a lovely audience, and off you go. Welcome. Thank you, Jubilee.
Welcome. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'm sorry I'm flying blind so that I can see the screen and present it because of this format. And I'd like to thank particularly Lisa and Leslie, and of course Katie, for their incredible support for setting up PRAXIS 2020. So my name's Jubilee Smith. I'm from work in the School of Education. Many of you know me, and I teach technology and English. And my PhD has been sitting in the School of Environment, Science and Engineering over the last 2.5 years. And I'm moving back into the School of Education for the final part of my thesis because of one of my supervisors retiring. So I'd like to acknowledge that. I've been part of the School of Environment, and I've experienced some excellent support from that school over the last number of years. So for PRAXIS 2020, I wanted to present some of my information from my current thesis. But first of all, I'd like to acknowledge country. I'm in Lismore, and that is not quite my view, but my view over towards Mount Warning and to the mountain ranges north. And I'd like to acknowledge I'm in Lismore on the Widjabul country in the Bundjalung Nation. And I believe it's so important to me to recognise that what we do as educators and as researchers, that more has gone before. So I'd like to acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging, particularly the role that they play in educating for our children and educating for the future. and acknowledging that they're actually the first people of this country and of this land. And without them, we wouldn't be here to inform this important part of education in the future. So I'd like to also thank the Southern Cross Postgraduate Association. Special thanks to the SCPA, and of course to Katie, who set this incredible online conference up. I am flying blind, so I can't see the people out there. So I'd like to acknowledge you in recognising that in your roles as educators, as learners, and as researchers, that we all form an important part of the future of education in this country and indeed the world. The role that each of you plays in children's lives cannot be underplayed, whether you're a teacher, an educator, a researcher, you work at Southern Cross University, you work in any other field, you're part of the emerging future. And digital technology is not something that is new. In fact, it's been around for a number of years, and I won't go into the past history of all of these aspects of the role of digital technology, of technology in education, or indeed in early childhood. But I will say that the significant changes, particularly over the last 20 and 10 years, most significantly for early childhood, in the emergence of new digital technologies and interactive technologies that are highly accessible by children and indeed highly accessible by those in society, has meant that there have been changes, challenges and opportunities for educators. So that's what I've named this presentation today. So this presentation today will include just a little snapshot of some of my research. I'm right at the end of writing my thesis and of writing up my findings about my early childhood educators, or my participants in my research. And this is with 16 early childhood educators regarding their decision making about digital technology in their early childhood educational settings. So a little bit about the research so far. The various educators that I interviewed were from a range of settings. And one of the things that I've done throughout my thesis is explore and try and understand from the perspectives of the educators what has influenced their decision making with digital technology and how they use digital technology with children and indeed in their practice. And what emerged were that there were barriers and there were enablers. And my initial questions were around these narrow, I guess in some ways, these narrow questions about what were the barriers or enablers. As I've continued to investigate my findings, it's become apparent that is not strictly speaking just about barriers or enablers, but of course on how these educators have been experiencing the technology, their professional experience, their knowledge, their practice has influenced their use of digital technology with children. So in fact, one of the things that I've found has been that there have been emerging influences on these educators, and that these are both professional and personal, and that of course these exist in an ecological system. And many of you will be familiar with Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems model. And one of the things that I've been trying to do throughout writing up my findings is to continue to go back to what those educators have said. So when I've been looking at my research aim, I've looked at how educators have made decisions, but from their perspective. So I haven't observed practice. What I did was conducted, say, a survey, a small survey, to give me some information about what sort of things would be influencing educators and what educators were considering about digital technology use in early childhood. So then I conducted the interviews with educators about their decision making with digital technology, and this is the result of those interviews. So there have been many changes, and just to give you a little bit of background, many of you will have experience and have used technology yourself, and that's what one of the I guess the premises of my initial research was that the current state of play, or the current state of education in Australia and in the world, has been influenced directly by the emergence of digital technology in our lives, in our personal lives and our professional lives. And of course, that has infiltrated or impacted upon children's lives and education and how we engage with digital technology just on a daily basis. It's become ubiquitous. So those changes and those things that have emerged in technology and of course in education impacted upon my thinking as an educator and as a researcher to think about and to consider how do early childhood educators themselves engage with technology, but indeed how do they make decisions with technology, both with children, how they would use it with children and themselves. One of the things that became obvious, and of course I started my research a number of years ago and based on some pilot studies back in 2014. So that's a number of years ago. And at that time there was no clear or no guidance for early childhood educators specifically or directly to do with their use of digital technology in early childhood. They were being, of course, using their professional knowledge and their educational experiences, and of course the curriculum frameworks in Australia, the early years learning framework and the other frameworks and national standards in early childhood, engage them in thinking about how they would use technology within those frameworks. But of course there is no one simple answer, and Early Childhood Australia, ECA Australia, undertook some research at a similar time that I commenced my research, and their research was to do with presenting and creating a digital statement or a statement on the use of digital technology. And this is one of the things that they presented when in 2018 they presented their statement. Now, a little bit of background is that my research was conducted before or during the time that they were also conducting their research into digital technology use and a digital statement for educators. So in some ways, mine was a little bit before, but at the same time as their research is being undertaken. So it hasn't been informed directly by the ECA digital statement, but it's quite interesting because some of the results that they presented mirror the results that I've got, but also they speak to the future of digital technology in early childhood education. The increasing availability was one of the impetuses for me as thinking about how technology would influence and impact on early childhood education. And I think Maria Hatzigiani, and interesting, I got to meet Maria last year at an early childhood conference, and it was very exciting and it's very interesting to see how across the world that we're recognizing how important we have to not ignore technology. And I think that's one of the things that has been a particular challenge in early childhood education, is that in our lives, technology has permeated everything we do. It's become ubiquitous, but we also need tools to be able to reflect and to think about how and why and what we use. In Australia, of course, decisions are guided by these standards, and I mentioned this before. One thing that is interesting and I found quite challenging for myself as a primary school educator, one of the things that I found quite challenging was that we work within curriculum documents, and their curriculum documents in the primary setting are a little bit different because these are not prescriptive per se, but they're descriptive, but they allow, I guess, educators and teachers with a little bit more framing of what they will teach and how they will engage students in learning about the particular content. In early childhood, that is different. And it's really important that we recognise those differences when we do talk about education. And one of the things about early childhood education is the frameworks are more open-ended, more child-centred, more play-based pedagogy is the approach in Australia and indeed across the world. There's strong evidence to suggest how important this approach is, and strong evidence to suggest that early childhood educators use their personal philosophies and highly recognise educational philosophies to engage student or children in learning. And that framework, in fact, is really important to allow for open-ended or opportunities for children's learning in an open-ended environment and in a play-based environment to allow children to explore their interests and to be supported in exploring their interests. So I wanted to put that as a framework to recognise that in the early childhood context, you might be guided by children's children's interests and their needs in a really different way to what you would be in a normal educational setting, or rather the formal educational setting. And I wanted to just contextualize that, because early childhood educators don't sit there and plan what they're going to necessarily teach in the early childhood context. And engaging in making decisions about the types of resources and the tools that they might use, that will be very much guided by children's interests, their needs, and indeed the context. And this is presenting, I just wanted to show you a little bit of a context from a Reggio Emilia context of children exploring and creating their own water bird fountain for birds, and a play area for birds. And this was based on the Reggio Emilia 100 languages of children and a Reggio Emilia context. And it's really important to early childhood educators to work within the context that they're working with the children. And what becomes important too is that their decisions are embedded into that context. Their decisions are embedded into a context that understands children's needs, their well-being, their physical, social, emotional, and cognitive needs, but not in the context of teaching them a preset curriculum. And that's an important part to recognise. I won't read through all of this, but I guess the statement I really want to make is that at the time that I commenced my research, and indeed even now, that there still are no set ways for educators to make decisions. That decision making is an opportunity, and I see that an opportunity was presented to me by trying to understand a little bit more about how early childhood educators made their decisions about using digital technology. And one of the things that is important to note is that early childhood educators are highly skilled and highly educated individuals, making very, very important decisions about children's engagement in learning opportunities each day. The research questions that I was asking, and I have been asking in my thesis, are these, but this one today is what do they envisage about the future of digital technology in early childhood? And one of the things that I suppose I just wanted to present was a snapshot of my very small qualitative research project to do with understanding and interpreting how those early childhood educators saw their decision making and had their perspectives on their own decision making. It's been informed very much by an interpretive philosophy and of course socio-cultural theory and an ecological systems model. And one of the things that is important to note is that this is fairly small scale, that I conducted interviews, but I haven't conducted observations of these educators, and many of these educators are not what we would consider to be highly visible users of digital technology in their practice. And so it's important to note that all early childhood educators are able to make their own decisions about digital technology and, of course, indeed, how they engage children in learning activities or experiences within the setting. All of the educators were currently working with children.
Jubilee.
Thank you.
Jubilee, you saw the warning?
Yes, yep. Excellent. Okay. So thank you. I'll continue.
3-minute warning. Okay, good.
I'm getting there.
Yeah.
What do they envisage the future of digital technology in early childhood? So the educators had a generally positive view. They generally were positive about the future of digital technology in early childhood, but they were cautious. They were cautious in a reflective manner, cautious to think about how they could use a digital technology to enhance children's learning and not to detract from children's learning and experiences in early childhood. So the children would still have an opportunity to engage in a range of experiences, physical experiences, social experiences, and to engage in supporting their well-being and their interests. And of course, to support their knowledge of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. I notice I missed that off. But it was considered, digital technology was considered to be an important learning resource to support children and educators. So what is the change, challenge and opportunities? And of course, I'm running out of time. I think these are important to share, but these educators had hopes for the future. They were thinking about how we could move away from just touching the button to doing this, to be able to actually have a meaningful purpose to use technology. They were interested in making sure and understanding how they could use digital technology and expose students to digital technology in a positive way. But they also saw that they had that there were challenges to be able to integrate it meaningfully. You can see this little sound box, and this is one, not one that I've observed, but I do know educators have used it, where they're recording something on an iPad as children. And the educators in this particular situation didn't feel that they necessarily had the knowledge, skills or confidence to use digital technology. And so that was a challenge for them. How could they balance their own knowledge with what they knew and believed about children's needs, and of course their well-being and their learning? And of course, how could they balance their own philosophy of early childhood education and integrating digital technology in that meaningful way? Many of them were very passionate about nature, the environment, creativity and the arts, and some of those things presented challenges and how they could balance that between what they saw to be fairly limited ways of using digital technology at this point. I don't want to go too far into my findings, but I think it's really important to note that these educators really believed in early childhood education. They all expressed their incredible passion and their belief in the value of early childhood education for children's lives, for their future, and reiterating how important it was that they were listening to children, they were engaging in children's interests, but they weren't making assumptions. So it's really important to note that some of the challenges were, of course, in how did they balance that between their physical, social and emotional well-being and the use of technology in a meaningful way. And of course, there is a big push for science, technology, engineering and mathematics. And of course, I think that many educators also see that this is an opportunity to increase that. But of course, they kept mentioning how important it was that they enhance children's learning and their experiences, and that digital technology presented an opportunity to be able to help children to engage with the world, engage with their interests and extend their skills and knowledge about those aspects. To be able to engage in learning in meaningful and purposeful ways, not as a passive exercise, but as an active exercise. But they saw challenges for access, funding, and of course, finding a balance between their needs, between well-being, time in nature, and technology use. And numerous instances were given where it's important that early childhood retained the role as an important opportunity to extend children's interests, not to preconceive the curriculum or the content, but to be able to ensure that children were being, belonging and becoming. And I think this is one of the things that the early childhood learning, early years learning framework, to understand the role, the responsibility of educators to be able to ensure that children are learning in a supportive environment. And of course, to extend their interests, engage them in communication, in research, in investigation, and using technology for a meaningful purpose. So in summary, my research at its very end, I'm hoping to be able to share with you many more of the findings, to be able to see and understand how these early childhood educators envisage the future, and of course to be able to understand their role in being able to make their decisions in a purposeful and meaningful way in early childhood in the future, using technology as one of the many resources that they might use. So where to next? I'm at the final stages of completing my findings chapter. My next phase is, of course, to write the discussion chapter and, of course, to complete the thesis with recommendations for the future. So I hope you found this interesting, and apologise for the speediness of the end point, but if you have any questions, please stick around. I'd like to acknowledge my supervisors, Professor Bill Boyd and Dr. Wendy Boyd, and of course I wouldn't be here without their incredible support to go on this journey. So thanks to both Bill and to Wendy. And here are my references, and I'll stop sharing. So thank you,
Jubilee. Thank you so much. How to get a whole entire thesis into 15 minutes. Yeah. So well done. That was a really great snapshot of your incredible and very intense and thorough work. So well done on that. And thank you for that presentation. We are a little bit over time, but we have a 10-minute break in between yours and Sarah's. Sarah starts at 11:35, which is in 8 minutes. So I think if we have 3 minutes, if anybody wants to ask Jubilee a very quick question that Jubilee has a very quick answer to, we have 3 minutes for some questions, and then we'll say goodbye and we'll send you off to the next Zoom link, which is Sarah's, which you have to click out of here and click into that. So if anybody wants to turn their camera on, it looks like Sarah has her hand up for a question.
Hey Jubilee, thank you. That was so good. I'm so stoked to hear that you're towards the end of your thesis. Last year I sort of rode some of the journey with you, teaching alongside of you, and I know you were, in a space of flux, and now it seems to the calm has come and you sort of worked out where you needed to be. It's more of a comment, and I wrote it in the chat. It's like, the voices of the children. What have you found? What is so, it's obviously so important to be listening to the students. What are your thoughts about, working with students and hearing their voices?
I would actually love to do that. That sort of, every time I think of, let's do another research thing, and Wendy says, that's your postdoc, that's your postdoc. Yeah, right. And, because lots of things kept emerging, and yes, I agree. I think that is the next very important thing. There's some really exciting research happening in Australia at the moment. Marilyn Fleer, Susan Danby, Susan Edwards, and others to do with conceptual play worlds. If some of you saw Marilyn Fleer's work, Susan Dansby is digital childhoods. Of course, you've got Pasi Sahlberg, growing up digital. So there's some really exciting things happening in Australia. And I'm really excited, because last year I got to go to Greece and meet some of the people that I'm quoting. So that's all, and I've got photos. Hi, can I get a photo of you? I've got you in my thesis. So yeah, I agree. I think that's the really big challenge for us in education, is that we've got, we can see an agenda and we can understand our perspectives, but understanding children's voices are really quite critical. And there's some really exciting opportunities for us. So if anyone's interested in that space, particularly around early childhood, and recognising how much of a critical role it plays in setting children up, not for success in society, but for themselves, to be individuals in this world, to engage in the world, to be environmental, socially responsible beings, in understanding how the world works. And I think that job of early childhood educators is actually critical for that. So, yeah, so thanks for that question, Sarah. Postdoc, right?
That's great. And if anybody else has any questions for Jubilee that they weren't able to ask, or also, once things kind of settle and you go, you in a few hours, and you wake up in the middle of the night, you can message Jubilee through, well, obviously through her student email, but also on the Hoover app, there's a messaging scenario that you can use and keep contact that way.
And Lisa, I want